In PoE 2, the systems for both critical hit damage and critical hit chance are surprisingly nuanced. In this video, we're going to dive into each of them so you can get a better handle on how to tune your builds both offensively and defensively with respect to crits. Let's jump in. As with most systems in PoE, the critical strike and critical damage system is largely symmetrical between players and monsters. For this video, we'll go through with an example kind of from the player's perspective, but just keep in mind that most of this is also true in the inverse. There are a couple of small differences that I'll call out as we go through this, but again, these systems are largely the same. For attacks, abilities which use your weapon, your critical hit chance will actually be listed on the weapon itself as a percentage. Spells differ a little bit in that the spells are actually the source of your critical hit chance, but we'll get into some of the differences between attack and spell crits in a bit. Here is where the first of our kind of crit chance modifiers comes into play. Weapons can actually roll with a plus X% to crit chance, and this will actually impact the crit chance that's listed on the weapon. The crit chance number will turn blue, and this is like kind of a flat increase percentage that'll affect all attacks that are made with this weapon. This is actually a pretty potent affix, and we'll kind of circle back to this as we go. Just keep in mind that this is kind of a additive step that occurs before all other crit chance calculations occur. So let's say, for example, we've got a weapon that would normally have 15% crit chance, but it happens to roll a plus 5% to crit. So it would normally be like 15, and it would instead display as a 20% crit chance mace or whatever weapon type you're using, and this is kind of the number that we'll use to start with. Just as with damage modifiers, there's actually a couple different types of modifiers which impact crit chance. The first of these is the large increased and reduced pool. Let's say we've got a bunch of passives or affixes on other pieces of gear that are giving us increased percent crit chance. We can say we've got like a plus 20% if the enemy has an ailment, and plus 10% flat, and then like another plus 10% for attacks made with a weapon. What this will kind of yield is our first crit chance modifier pool. So we'll say this is like a 1.5% increase because 20, 10, 10, 10 is 5, so we're going to multiply our crit chance by 1.5 as it's the product of all of our increase and reduced affixes and effects. But there are actually more and less affixes for crit chance as well, just as there are with damage. So we'll say we have one that's like a 10% more buff. I think charged infusion is something like that. And then we actually have this 1.1 factor here, and this will get multiplied by our other crit chance factors. Let's say we've got another 15% more multiplicative bucket here for crit chance as well. So this would give us another 1.15 multiplier. How this is going to work for a given attack is we're going to start with our 20% crit chance. We'll multiply it by our 1.5 multiplier step to give us 30%. Then that'll be multiplied by our 1.1 step to give us like 33%. Then that'll get multiplied by our 1.15 step to give us 38% or whatever that would be. But this will be our kind of output critical hit chance with this attack. So how does this actually get applied? What does 38% crit chance mean? On the surface, it seems pretty simple. It's just like, this is the percentage of the time that you will crit, but there's a little bit of nuance here. What's actually going to happen here is every time you attack a monster, there's going to be a random roll that's between 0 and 99.99. If this roll is below your crit chance, it'll be a critical hit. For the most part, when you make an attack, that critical hit roll is shared across the attack. So if you're swinging a sword and hitting multiple enemies, that same roll will apply to all of them. But that doesn't mean that it actually will crit them all, because your crit chance against enemies can actually differ. There are actually buffs and debuffs which will increase or decrease your crit chance against certain enemies. Critical weakness is a good one of these we'll use as our example, but let's say that this attack is actually branching and hitting a couple of different enemies. If one of them is impacted by critical weakness, what it's going to do is it's going to increase your crit chance against them, and this increase actually will apply to your base. So this 15 to 20 would actually go up to whatever the critical weakness magnitude is, affecting your chance to hit this enemy with a crit. Because your attacks are hitting multiple enemies and only some of them may have a debuff like this, even though the roll is shared, that means that sometimes you may crit against a subset of enemies, not all of them. It's also worth noting here that projectile attacks which fire multiple projectiles, those are generally an independent roll per projectile when they originate from the player. This is one of the cases where this system isn't totally symmetrical. For monsters, this roll is shared for all of their multi-projectile attacks. So if like you're hit by multiple projectiles from a monster, if one of them crits you, usually they all will. Evasion is another thing we should note here. Evasion can actually reduce a critical hit to a non-critical hit if the critical hit damage pushes the hit over over the evasion threshold. I've got another video I did all about defensive layers, and we go into evasion in depth there, so if you're curious, I'll link to it here. But just know that just because you crit something, if they're able to evade, that means that the crit may be downgraded back to an original, you know, like the unmodified damage. For the most part, all of these same systems apply to spells. The only difference is that because the spells are not derived from a weapon's damage, they can't really have this +% crit that's implicit on the weapon applied to them, so it's a little bit harder to get this base up. And this is again pretty potent because it's like a separate multiplicative step before we are into all of our other modifiers. So something to note, it can be a little bit harder to kind of get your spell base crit high because there's not this extra multiplicative bucket that is just adding to your base crit chance. Weapons also have a little bit of an advantage when it comes to critical hit damage. So let's talk about critical hit damage now. The critical damage bonus for players is 100%. So essentially, you will deal double damage as the baseline when you score a critical hit against an enemy. This is another place where this differs slightly for attacks from monsters against players, in that monsters have a +40% critical damage bonus. That's kind of their starting point. But as I just said, weapons kind of have the advantage that they also have a first step increase here that spells don't have. So a weapon can have an affix that'll say something like +10% increase critical damage bonus that will apply to attacks made with that weapon. So that would take your +100% critical damage bonus up to +110%. There are actually some skills which add at this point as well, like Sniper's Mark comes to mind. So Sniper's Mark adds a flat critical damage bonus to the base. So it says something like +70% critical damage bonus, and it would give you 170% if you had no other modifiers to your base critical damage. But from there, we're in the realm of critical damage pools. So this is very similar to the critical hit chance pools or like regular damage pools, but there are increased critical damage affixes. You'll see these in the passive tree, like on weapons and stuff, and just like elsewhere, the increased affixes all get summed. So let's say we've got like a 10% base, and then we've got one that's like +15% critical damage against enemies on low life, and then +15% on weapon attacks. These get summed and added to a 1.4 times multiplier to our base critical damage. There are also more and less affixes for critical damage. Pain Attunement is one of those on the passive tree. I'll bring it up here. But it's kind of another standalone multiplier step for your critical damage bonus specifically. So let's say we've got Pain Attunement and we're on low life, so it's giving us an extra 30% more critical damage bonus. That would be another multiplier here by 1.3. So, just like with crit strike chance and damage overall, we then can multiply these together to figure out our overall crit damage bonus. So we take 110 times 1.4 times 1.3, and that yields like 200% crit damage bonus. So just to kind of flesh out our example here, let's say we were doing an attack that happened to crit and it was doing exactly 100 damage. If we didn't have any crit bonuses, it would then just be doing 200 damage. But because we've increased our crit damage bonus from 100% to 200%, it'll now do 300 damage. As the player, there are some things you can do to mitigate critical hits against you and critical damage against you, but they're a little bit class dependent. The thing to know is that how those work is they essentially affect these pools. So you'll see increased and reduced critical hit chance against you, and what that will basically do is lower this multiplier, and it can be even less than 1, so it'll be a net reduction for crits against you. Same with damage, you can add a like lower than 1 multiplier here with less modifiers or decreased modifiers to pull this pool down, and that'll yield lower numbers on both the crit hit chance and the crit damage bonus pool against your character. Ailments are the only other thing I wanted to touch on briefly here. For the most part, ailments don't do anything special with crits because ailments are all derived from the amount of damage that's done. By virtue of doing more damage, generally the ailments inflicted upon you or that you are inflicting will be increased in magnitude based on, you know, a crit because they're doing more damage. I did a video on ailments that kind of does a deep dive on how ailment threshold works. If that's of interest to you, I'll put a link here. The only exception to this rule that I know of is that there are gems that you can use on the passive tree that will increase the magnitude of ailments with critical hits explicitly by some percentage value. So if you're running a build that is crit and inflicting ailments, that might be something to look into. I think that's a pretty good wrap on the crit systems here. If it seems like I missed anything, or if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I'll pin a comment with corrections and kind of frequently asked questions if there's something that is unclear. If you enjoy these kind of deeper dives into the PoE systems, I've been learning a lot and enjoying putting them together, so please consider subscribing if you'd like to stay tuned for more. But I think that's about it. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.